Hi everybody. My name is Daniel Terdiman. I'm a senior writer with Fastcompany, and I'll be the moderator today. Thought I'd start off by letting my esteemed panelists introduce themselves.
Starting with me.
Yes.
I'm Erik Darnell. I'm the Chief Creative Officer at Baobab Studios. We're focused on doing immersive storytelling in VR where the viewer is a character in the story.
Hi, my name is Ryan Horrigan. I'm the Chief Content Officer of Felix and Paul Studios. We're a technology-enabled cinematic virtual reality studio.
Hi, I'm Yelena Rachitsky, and I'm an executive producer of experiences over at Oculus. And I help oversee our slate of beyond gaming content with Colum here.
Hi, I'm Colum Slevin. I'm the head of experiences at Oculus VR, and we work on narrative non-games experiences at Oculus.
My name is Claudia Southmartin. I work with Erik at Baobab Studios, and I have worked on Invasion and Asteroids.
Got it. Well, let's start off by showing a short trailer from Baobab. Hopefully this will work. Looks like it's playing.
I had been working for over 20 years directing feature animated films. I was a director on Ants and a writer and director on all the Madagascar films. And I decided that maybe it was time to try something different and put on a VR headset for the first time. It blew me away. It's like this undiscovered frontier.
We see virtual reality as a new medium for telling stories and creating great cinematic experiences that are character-driven. It allows people to be taken to places and to worlds that otherwise wouldn't exist.
At Baobab Studios, what we're trying to do is find the tools that we can use to have a great story and tell it well and have characters that audiences fall in love with, and do it in a context where the viewer is a part of the story.
Okay, well, so that's a little look at what Erik and his team has been building. Let's start off a little bit. If you could talk about, like Invasion was a really big hit, and then Asteroids is really good for getting people to feel emotion and what you call agency. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what it is about those projects that engenders emotion, empathy, things like that, and the science behind it a little bit, and then we'll move on to some other.
Sure. Well, Invasion was the first piece that we did in VR, and we kind of just stumbled into this idea that the viewer would be a little white bunny out on this frozen lake. So if you look down, you'd see you have a bunny body. If you squat, your belly sticks out, and your body follows you around wherever you go, and it explains why this other character is interested in you. But what we didn't anticipate was the way that people would react to this. They really felt like they were there in the story. They really felt like the bunny was aware of their presence and that it mattered to her. And I think this was the first time in any VR experience where the viewer was actually placed inside the story as a character. And for us, that's when we really discovered one of the superpowers of VR. And that is to bring the viewer inside the story and let them be a part of it. Of course, that revelation came with others, such as this medium is not like film. It's its own medium. It's not an extension of cinema. It's something completely different. It's something brand new. And a big part of what makes it different is that you really feel like you're connected. When that character looks at you, it's not like an actor. It's not like Kevin Spacey looking at the camera in House of Cards. I never believe he really sees me in my living room watching him. But when that bunny looks at you, you really feel like she knows you're there. And then, so we have this connection, this communication that's happening. And it can be really super powerful. And a lot of it happens in in a subconscious or unconscious way. One of the things we experimented with in Asteroids is this idea of mirroring. And I'll be brief, but there was a study done at Stanford where they had a salesman basically deliver a sales pitch, a computer-animated salesman, deliver a sales pitch to the test subjects. And in the control group, they just delivered the sales pitch. And in the test group, the computer-animated salesman would adapt whatever pose the viewer or the listener had at the time. So if the listener crossed their arms, 4 seconds later, the salesman would cross their arms. Or if they leaned forward, the salesman would lean forward. And none of the test subjects recognized or realized that they were being mirrored. But they were 30% more likely to buy the product the salesman was selling, and they were 30% more likely to say that they liked the salesman. And this is all through the power. I mean, we see it all the time. You go out to a restaurant and two lovers are sitting across the table and they both have their hands on their chin, you know, and it's a way of saying, I like you, I care about you, and it all happens under the radar. So in Asteroids, we do this with this little pet robot character that if the viewer cocks their head to the side, a moment later, the little robot dog will cock its head to the side and mirror the body language of the viewer. And these are the kinds of things that we can leverage off of in VR to create a kind of connection, a kind of concern or care for these other characters that you could never get in a cinematic experience, for example. So that's some of the stuff we're doing.
Got it. Yelena, you guys showed me a project not too long ago that I'm blanking on the name on, but it's the sitting down.
On Love VR?
Yeah. So tell me a little bit. I mean, it sounds like there's some of the same types of interactivity there and mirroring and a little bit there. Can you tell me a little bit about that project?
Yeah, definitely. So this project was an experiment that we had in, can you create something that feels like a natural conversation with a non-human? And it was a pre-recorded of an actual person, and it's based on the 36 questions of love. I don't know how many of you read that New York Times piece where you ask these 36 questions to each other, and by the end of it, you're supposed to be in love with each other. So we thought, can you fall in love with someone who's not actually present and they're pre-recorded? And it had voice recognition, which is actually really powerful when you're hearing your own voice and then you're getting a response back. And that like natural way of being a human creates a connection. It's not fully developed. It's not fully there yet to have fully natural conversations within VR, but it also just showed kind of a starting point of consequences of using your voice. Initially, we tried to do it as a little bit of a back and forth. We realized that it's a little too early for that right now, so it was a one-way conversation.
Why did Oculus want to get involved in that project?
Yeah, I think we're constantly trying to think of what can be the most powerful experiences that haven't yet been created. Sometimes we create projects that are fully polished, that are connected to a really large brand and IP, and we know that's a necessary thing for the platform. And sometimes you want to take chances on experimenting with things so that we can learn from them, and how can we put them into other projects from what we learned. So can we create natural communication? Can we create a relationship with a character who's not actually there with you? And that was just a step in us figuring that out.
Right. So let's step a little bit back. There's lots of things to talk about with emotion and empathy and interactivity and all that. But I think before we can even get to that, I think it's important to understand like where the VR industry is right now. And I'd love to hear your thought. Sort of each of you kind of share your thoughts on what is the state of the VR industry right now. Want to start, Claudia?
Sure. Well, I'm very excited the more tools that we have to input user positioning. On Invasion, we were working with no controllers. There was no way to track the user's hands, and we were really just focused on look at with Chloe the bunny. And on Asteroids, we were working with touch controllers and had much more sophisticated input devices so that we could really start interacting with our robot character Ps in a meaningful way. And these are tools like, so the look at, the tracking of the hands, the throwing the ball, all proved to be really powerful ways to kind of build the relationship with the character. And super early on in Asteroids, we prototyped a very rough game of catch with this character. There was no lighting, there was no materials. It was very rough animation. And we showed it around, and we got so much positive feedback that was the area that we kind of focused on the most for Asteroids, the kind of the interactive moment with Ps, which was largely because of the improvements in the haptic input of the devices.
Where do you think the industry is right now?
Right now? So I think what you're saying, Claudia, is super interesting because of where you're at now with the tools that are available, and it also relates to what Yelena was saying about fall in love, which is in the content industry in VR in this. I always get in trouble a little bit when I say VR is 2 years old, because then you hear people like Jared Lanier and other people coming up saying, I've been doing it since 1980.
I always like make sure to write that it's the consumer VR.
Consumer VR. So the interesting thing is, in the first 12 to 18 months, game developers had this massive head start because the tools were native and familiar to game developers. They jumped right in and just took off and running. And also the learning curve was shallower for game developers, whereas filmmakers and every other kind of storyteller and people like Erik and Baobab and Felix and Paul were, first of all, working with unfamiliar tools with real time, working with tech that was prototypey and crude, to say the least. And what's super exciting right now is you're starting to see storytellers and filmmakers becoming conversant with real-time tools, using interactivity, trying to create a conversation in VR, which is completely crazy and unheard of a year ago. Classically trained storytellers like Erik starting to build real interactivity into their experiences. So it feels like a real sort of a second, plateau for the storytelling realm.
Yelena, do you have thoughts on where we're at for the industry?
Yeah, I think we're in a really exciting space right now. And what I think of, just when I think of the landscape, where 2 years ago on panels, the whole panel was just about the question, can you tell a story in VR? And I think all of us doing panels, and I haven't gotten that question in over a year. So I don't think people are questioning, can you tell a story in VR? They're seeing that people are really making interesting, powerful experiences. And the other thing I'm seeing a lot, especially, you gauge things sometimes by the festivals and seeing what's out there. And a couple years ago, everything felt like prototypes. And now I feel like we have fully polished high-end experiences like Dear Angelica, like Pearl, like things that aren't just about the potential of something, but pieces on their own that just are incredibly compelling, artful, and high quality. And then you also have, I think Colum was mentioning, people who are experimenting a lot with new types of technology. Are we doing interactive? Are we doing AI? And that's really, really exciting. And then you have Felix and Paul's team with Ryan, which I think is something I find to be really inspiring, is that they're not jumping into things that are like eye candy and new technology, but just thinking deeply about the intention of a story and getting better and better and better at that, because that is still incredibly necessary, even though the innovation in a sense is slightly invisible. So you have a little bit of that spectrum. So all of that kind of going on at the same time is just, I think, going to be resulting in a lot of really great things these upcoming couple of years.
And people are winning Emmys.
Lots of Emmys, guys. There's like 6 Emmys were nominated for VR this past year. Felix and Paul's team worked on a project that we worked on with them around Obama. And last year, Henry, which was, I think, one of the first, few VR projects that explored storytelling in VR, won the first Emmy for an original interactive piece, which helped push it more into the mainstream, which is great.
Ryan, what's your thoughts on the state of the industry?
Yeah, I think you're seeing the technology advance on the one hand from the consumer side of displays and how easy can we get how can we get these headsets into people's hands more easily? And we're seeing things like the Oculus Go get announced, which is, in my view, a game changer, and I think a lot of other people feel the same way. And then you have the creation side of, what tools do we have at our disposal to work with, and you have the storytelling side, and both the tech and the storytelling side are going to advance at their own rate. A lot of people expect that they should be hand in hand, but they're really on 2 separate tracks. And a lot of what we think about is how can we embrace the technology we have and make it work for the narratives we want to tell, rather than the other way around. For us, the story has to come first, and what we're doing often is figuring out, well, if we have limitations, how can we embrace those limitations, narratively speaking, so that plausibility is always there? You want to believe, to Erik's point earlier, that you're in the story. You want to believe why you're there. You want to believe, in how much or little you can interact and what you can do. So every time we start a new concept or start to think about that, it usually starts with plausibility and context for you, the viewer. One example is we did a live action piece with Oculus, Funny or Die, called Miyubi, which premiered at the Sundance Film Festival. And this was a group of actors. It was a story about a family in the early 80s. The son of the family received an 80s toy robot. And you were the robot, so you spent a year in the life of the family in 1982. And it was important for us to understand sort of, well, in a 360 video, even though we had a real-time asset, that was you, your body, you have this kind of photoreal body, you can't move around inside of a recorded scene. You can't talk to people in a recorded scene like maybe you could in a game engine. So we had certain limitations, and if you're going to be a character, you have to deal with those limitations. So it felt right for us for you to be an inanimate object, because an inanimate object inherently, in most places, doesn't talk to people yet or walk around under its own free will. So we think a lot about that as we approach story. And what we're starting to see now in the creative community is we're seeing people carve out their own niche, and we're seeing specialists and people who are becoming known for things. But at the same time, no one wants to be put into a box. So we're all experimenting in things we're not good at. For us, we're experimenting with game engine and light field technology and building our own technology. So it's a really exciting time.
So Miyubi, one thing you didn't mention about it is it's like 45 minutes long, right?
Yeah, 40.
Okay, 40 minutes long. That's like much longer than most VR experiences. So what do you have a sense of like how many people that that viewed it, like? Or does everybody stick all the way through? And if so, like how do you keep them there for that whole time? Because it's a long time to have a headset on for one story.
We were really worried about that. We intended to make probably a 25-minute story, and through writing and improv on set, it became this 40-minute story with interactivity and where you could unlock other threads of the narrative. And we were excited about that, but nervous mostly about the file size and the delivery to consumers. And since we've released it, we found that the PC version is a little bit easier to play and digest, but we're seeing really great results also on the Gear VR. And the biggest surprise to us was the amount of time people actually stuck with the story. We had really no idea if people would drop off after 5 or 10 minutes, and we're seeing well over, I think, 80–90% of people stick through almost the whole experience the first time, especially on the premium kind of tethered headsets.
We went into Miyubi with a collective hypothesis that we wanted to prove out, will people stick with a story, a long-form story? And Miyubi proved that hypothesis for us at Oculus for sure, that if it's a good story and if it's told well, people will stay all the way through.
Right. How long is the full version of Asteroids?
It depends, but it tends to run somewhere between 12 and 13 minutes, I think.
So that's much shorter than something like Miyubi. Did you ever think, let's turn this into? I mean, I know there's like a theatrical version that's going to come out of the story, but like for the VR version, did you think, we could do this 20, 30 minutes, or did you feel like, the 12, 13 minutes is really the sweet spot for that type of story? Or?
Well, it became kind of the default length because that was the story that we were telling. Although we were fairly cautionary about duration, and a lot of factors are involved in whether or not somebody will sit through something. Of course, it has to be high quality content. That's the most important thing. But the comfort of the headset and other distractions and all these things. So it's fantastic to see that these longer pieces are able to keep an audience, and it shows the potential. Everybody often is asked, when do you think there'll be a full-length VR piece? And it's like, I don't know what that means. I don't think we have to fit into the cinema paradigm of 98 minutes or whatever. I think it can be whatever the piece wants, and maybe eventually we'll fall into sort of more standardized times, but I don't see it any time soon. In the longer term, as more robust and focused distribution models are established, maybe there will be sort of durations that start to get honed in on. But I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. You're talking about like the state of the current, VR industry, and we're kind of following this classic curve for new technology, where there's all of this incredible hype and excitement, and it actually is going to exceed, what reality is. And then of course the headsets come out, and they don't quite. It's not quite the holodeck yet, right. And so then you go into this trough of despair, and then you have a much more rational, reasonable climb, and I think that's hopefully now just starting to kick in, but it's going to take some time. We're pretty conservative because we need to be if we're going to stay in business, and so we think it could be many years before there's a real stable marketplace.
I want to get back to that point, but you touched on something. This is a developers conference. We've got people here who clearly are going to be interested in making content for VR platforms. Last week at Oculus Connect, Mark Zuckerberg went up on stage and apparently surprised even his chief scientist at Oculus by saying, he wants VR he wants to have 1 billion people in VR. That's a huge number. We're not anywhere near that right now, but like, what does it take to get there? I mean, it's not going to happen overnight, but like, how do we get to 1 billion users? And there's a little bit of a chicken and egg, right? People don't want to develop content for platforms that don't have the users. People don't want to use platforms that don't have great content. So how do we get to that 1 billion users?
That's exactly the problem. I might turn it over to you, Ryan, because I heard you say something kind of interesting about the differences between, establishing a solid market for VR versus, companies like Netflix, which have completely, changed the model for distributing films. But I thought it was interesting what you said that Netflix, Amazon, whatever, there was already something to work from,
yes.
Right? You remember that?
I do, yeah. Well, if you think about Netflix, they had 15 years of delivering DVDs in the mail before they started streaming. They had something to pivot from. If you think about Amazon, they built a business for 20 years, shipping books to your house. So starting from nothing is incredibly hard. And I think there's no like magic bullet, it seems, or at least that's my feeling. It's a combination of things. It's getting better hardware for less money in people's hands with less friction and better content at the same time. That's why I'm so excited when I see like the Oculus Go headset, because I have a lot of friends who are in the film and TV business who are really interested in VR, and they always ask me about it. They want to see stuff, but they haven't bought a headset. And for those types of people, maybe they're not PC gamers, they're not going to buy a PC, and they're Apple users and they have an iPhone, but now all of a sudden, that doesn't matter anymore, So I think that's just one piece of it, and I think the content, just must-see content, and things that people feel like are of a certain quality, or also just an experience they could never have possible. And for us, we certainly always ask the question, why VR? I don't think that's a rule. No one has to ask that question. There's plenty of people making content because some stories in 360 are more interesting or cooler, but for us, we want to get to like the narrative core of what is the storytelling advantage in VR that I couldn't get in cinema or television. And for us, that's a problem every time we talk about a story. But even if it's a subtle solution, just for ourselves as a guiding light or a principle, we feel like that's important to us, to not just make films in VR.
Mm-hmm. Let's have thoughts on how to get to 1 billion users?
Yeah, more quality content.
Right.
One at a time. I feel like, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I just totally interrupted you, didn't I?
Totally
I apologize. I'll come back to you. It feels like it's the content. It's getting to that, enabling creators to experiment, to find, this magic intersection of something that you can't see anywhere else, you can't experience anywhere else, so that you're telling your friends, you got to get one of these things because it's the only way you can experience this alien kidnapping bunny thing. It's got to get to that.
Yeah, it's a combination of, I think what Ryan was saying, the content and the hardware. And I think we're making the steps there with Oculus Go and the other announcements that we had. And it's content, but I think the thing a lot of people are also missing is figuring out how to get attention for their content. And people aren't, even if you think about films in the film industry, if you make a film and you don't tell anyone about it or know how to market it out there, no one's going to watch it. So that needs to get a lot better of how we tell our stories, how we share something that really can only be experienced in the right way in VR, but then also thinking more expansively. And I think Baobab's done a great job of taking their content and putting it on all platforms and not being so incredibly precious, so that people know about it and people get excited about it, and it just becomes a known thing in the mainstream beyond what a lot of our bubbles are. So we definitely need to get a lot better at that. And there's some great ideas that haven't been tested yet.
I'll put this out to all of you. Like, what are some new trends that you're seeing in content, in types of content, types of experiences, not counting games? Especially things that you think are exciting and that are gonna push the medium forward.
Well, one thing that's great is the less expensive headsets, that Samsung has pioneered, and the new ones coming out of Oculus, I think are going to really help fire up this market. I also think that being able to have inside-out tracking in non-tethered headsets, so that you can actually, go down on your, you can bend your knees, you can walk around the room and feel so much more immersed than if it's just tracking, head rotation. That's going to be huge, and the price point for those headsets are, they're affordable, and so I think that's going to really help. And getting people into a headset in any way we can, whether it's demos at places, like stores that sell electronics, anything, because just a show of hands, how many people have tried a VR headset on? I would imagine probably almost everybody. But of course...
Actually, let me ask a different question. How many of the people in this room have, say, 5 other friends that have tried VR? Well, that's still pretty high.
Ooh.
But the thing about VR is that you can describe it to somebody all day long, but they will never know what it is until they put on a headset. And so we've got to get people to put headsets on. And when they do, we've got to make sure, to the best of our ability, that they're watching great content. Because however good content is in VR, bad content is 10 times worse. It's sort of like a poorly executed traditional 3D film can cause nausea and headaches and feel like somebody's like punching you in the forehead on every cut. And there were films that were done well in 3D, and there were films that were done poorly. And if you were one of those people that went to see your first 3D film, and it was poorly done, and you walked out with a headache, then you said, I will never go see one of those movies again. I'm going to go see 2D from now on. And you can really make people sick in VR if you do a bad job. You can make them uncomfortable. You can make them nauseous. And this is just biology. They did a study at University. No, it was at the Mayo Clinic, I think, or was it the University? It doesn't matter. But basically what they did was they put people in pretty extreme VR experiences, and then they timed how long it took them to rip their headset off and say, I can't stand this anymore. And then they tested their depth perception and found that the better your depth perception was, the quicker you took the headset off, the quicker you felt that discomfort. So it's directly tied in, to our biology and what our inner ear is telling us and what our eyes are seeing. And when that stuff is not connected, you're going to guarantee that the majority of your audience is going to have a crummy experience and may decide to never put a headset on again. And I've heard people say, well, you got to give time for the audiences to get used to it. And I can't think of a worse tagline, VR, get used to it. It's like
give it time.
Yeah, right. It's like if you're seasick on a boat, it doesn't help if somebody says, by tomorrow, you'll be fine. So I'm a pretty big evangelist for not making people nauseous in VR.
So Colum and Yelena, you guys are both on platform side as well as content. You must see all kinds of proposals and projects, and you've got a fairly large budget to invest in helping to produce content. Like, what are the things you really look for when you're trying to figure out where to put those dollars?
That's a good question. So I think we look at it in two ways. There's the projects that need to be made because we know that people are going to watch them, and a lot of them are associated with known brands. So we just announced their Pixar Vr project with the movie Coco, which is coming out next month, which we're really excited about, and it's Pixar's first project. Because VR is still a fairly foreign place for many people. So how do you create that sense of familiarity? And we're trying to get a lot deeper with those experiences rather than them being, blatant marketing pieces. But it's hard for something associated with a movie to not be seen as a marketing piece. But we do know that people want that familiarity. They want something that they understand, and then that becomes a gateway to them trying all the other projects. And then we're thinking a lot about how are we elevating the craft of VR? How are we making things better? And so we do experiments like Fall in Love, and we're working on a great piece right now called Dispatch, which is a fiction story of a 911 dispatcher where you go through his imagination, which VR is perfect for, kind of like a project called Notes on Blindness, where you have just this beautiful visuals, and they don't have to necessarily make sense because they're an imagination and something you can only really do in VR. So we do a lot of those independent projects as well, but we really think about how do we get people inside of headsets, how do we want them, how would they want to stay there longer, and how can we continue to keep them back, continue to have them coming back. So that can either come through interactivity, that it could either come through an episodic format. So it's not very specific to a genre in one sense. It's really, is it a great idea, and is it something that has potential from those two branches that we're looking at?
You guys have this VR for Good program. Can you say a little bit about what that is and why you're putting money into that one?
Well, I guess outside of the technological experiments and the obviously like slam dunk ideas about doing big IP that people are going to love, the part of the power of VR that you hear people like us talking about all the time is its potential to generate empathy and create a sense of empathy. But those projects don't necessarily get front and center funding or aren't always the first they're thought of, and certainly when big budgets are going towards marketing experiences for movies, they get overlooked. So Oculus has a conscious and separate team and funds set aside to focus on philanthropic causes, but also on creators that wouldn't necessarily otherwise get to create in VR. Because that sense of empathy and that sense of connection, which we've spoken about, is such a powerful byproduct of VR that it seems like a natural fit.
So I guess the question I was going to ask is is there something? What is it about this medium that is so good at generating the empathy, generating the emotion, and
I think it's the sort of alchemy that happens when you do when you don't unintentionally do what Erik was talking about, right? When everything's firing on all cylinders, and you've got amazing spatial audio, you've got a believable high frame rate, and you've got great embodiment, that you can create this sense of total immersion that sort of transcends the belief that you're wearing a piece of gear on your head, and you feel transported into someone else's experience.
One of the ways that we kind of describe it is like with this sort of thought experiment of like if say you're jogging through Central Park at sunrise and there's not a lot of people around, and you see this little girl, too young to be by herself, crying on a park bench. So what do? Well, if it's a game, you'll go interact with the girl. And your motives will probably be, perhaps I'll get some information that'll help me get to the next level, or I'll get some reward for helping her, or, it is a game after all, right? And it tends to be, and I'm not saying this in a negative way, but it tends to be very ego-driven in that sense. You are kind of the center of the universe. In a film, you see that little girl crying on a park bench, you feel sorry for her, but you don't have any inclination to take any kind of action. That would be ridiculous, right? But you care about her, and you hope no bad person comes by, and you hope that she's going to be okay, et cetera. And in real life, of course you'll go talk to her, but it's not because you're imagining that you'll get the key to the city or you'll get the clue to solve the puzzle. It's because you truly care, and you're motivated to talk to this girl because you care and you don't want anything bad to happen to her. So VR isn't reality, but it does have the agency of games and the ability to generate that empathy that cinema does. And then as a medium, because it's so immersive and it allows the viewer to so easily suspend their disbelief, that it can provide the motivation to act that sort of equates with our motives in real life. And that's a big goal of ours at Baobab, is to make people stop thinking that they're watching something that's happening somewhere else, but that they're actually there, that they actually have a bond with this character, and that they can turn that empathy into action, into compassion, right there on the spot. And even, if it's not an interactive piece, like Chris Milk's piece on, what's it, on the Syrian...
Clouds over Sidra.
Yeah, Clouds over Sidra. Yeah. The inclination of people, as soon as they took off their headsets, was to donate money. Where do I give money? How can I act on this empathy that I'm feeling? For us as storytellers, if we can actually provide that opportunity right there inside the story, then it raises the stakes for the viewer, and it makes it even that much easier to connect and suspend their disbelief and just go with that flowing story that's happening in front of them.
Yeah, and I think with VR, you feel with your whole body, and so it's. And I think what Erik was saying, if you watch something on a screen, that's something that you're kind of understanding cerebrally, but not with your full body in the emotional way that your body reacts to things. But there's also the power of intimacy in VR that's hard to replicate in other mediums. So it's a difference between having a conversation with a close friend one-on-one versus being part of a group, and you don't feel that same connection. So VR allows you to just be in that space and be able to look characters in the eye, to be able to be intimate in a surrounding. And VR just has these incredible tools to play with that play with your emotion in some way. So scale, for instance, is huge. Like Dear Angelica, even though it's a fiction story, when I don't know how many of you have seen it, but there's I guess it'll spoiler. But there's a part where her mom is dying, and they showed it just in a very small. The mom is very small on a bed and so incredibly frail, and just the smallness adds to this feeling of wanting to help her and feeling that sadness of someone you love going away, which you really connect with. And then there's parts of it where it just becomes so incredibly expansive, and that shifts the way that you emotionally experience something. We also released a project called Testimony, which was a project around sexual assault, and it had light interactivity where women and men talk about their stories of what they went through. And when you look at them, they get a little bit bigger, and they go from black and white to color. So you feel like you're listening to them, and all they want to do is just be heard. And when you hear them, they come to life, which is really powerful. And it's, approaches it in a very simple way, but you do feel more connected to this person and understand that their story needs to be heard, and you're not distracted. And there's just so many examples of projects that have happened that take you on this emotional journey.
So I can't remember what it was called, and I'm sure there's been more than one of these, but I've seen a project that actually puts you in the persona of a woman who's being harassed, right? Mm-hmm. Sort of, I think it was sort of geared towards men for men to maybe have a better understanding of what that experience is like. I mean, can that be effective? Do you think?
Well, absolutely, and I think that one thing I was going to hit on is it's about all the things that everyone's been talking about, but intimacy for sure. But for us, and I think for everyone, it's about subjectivity. It's like, can you put yourself in someone else's shoes? And the simplest way to describe it, like if I meet someone from the film world or any other world, and they say, well, what's different about this? I say, well, okay, film, television, theater, you sit outside the story, outside the frame, and you have a gap between you. Maybe you experience that story through the prism of someone else's authorship, like a filmmaker's authorship, and you kind of know when you go to the movie theater, you're watching David Fincher's Gone Girl, not Gone Girl as it was originally intended. But in VR, there's no filter. You are there, and it's a great opportunity to put you in someone else's shoes and play with subjectivity. So for us, when we did our second experience with President Obama in the White House, you know, what we initially were talking about was, okay, it's a tour of the White House, but how boring is that, right? So we realized if it's a tour of the White House through the memory of the president and through the emotional memory of the president about like raising his daughters there and seeing his wife there for the first time and the choices he made in each room and the past presidents who inspired him, and we sort of spatialize the audio just so it sounds like he's in your head and the other audio is out here, and we drift you through these moments as he's talking. We can conjure this feeling of you're in his actual memory. So for us, it's subjectivity and intimacy are definitely the most powerful tools.
Yeah, I was going to bring that up and actually have a little short video of that, if we can show that. It's just like a minute or something. Whoops. Oh, no. There we go. Is it playing?
You may have to hit play one more time.
I remember when I first walked in,
There we go.
and I looked around and I thought, it's actually not as big as I imagined it on television.
It really does feel like home to us. There are 2 floors upstairs, above state floors, and that's where our home is. That's where our children have grown up.
The White House is the people's house, and Michelle and I always joke, we're just renters here.
So one of the things I feel like the VR does is after you've been in an experience, it really does feel like you've been there. It almost feels like you've had that
a memory
experience yourself. Yeah, I mean, is that unique to VR? Or how unique to VR is it?
One of the things we mark as an anecdotal measure of success is when someone takes off the VR headset and they ask you how long they were in. I like everyone's heard that. When it's good,
yeah.
You know, people take off the headset and they go, "That was, what was that, 20 minutes?" And you go, "No, it was 2 minutes."
I get lost in time. Yeah. Then I think there was a project that Chris Milk did that I really like called Life of Us, and you go through the process of evolution with someone. And I was doing it with a friend at Sundance, and you start as this little amoeba, and then you change and you become this big gorilla, and your voice changes when you're an amoeba. You like talk like this, and then when you're a gorilla, you talk like Barry White. And it was the thing that stood out was after I got out of that experience, I felt like I just went on an adventure with my friend, similar to if we just took a trip somewhere, like went on vacation and just created that memory together. And that stuck with me as something that brought us a little bit closer because we had that experience together. And I think VR is one of the few things that allows you to do that apart from really getting on the plane and doing something. But the benefit is that you're not limited by reality.
And that's actually something we feel like at Baobob. Animation is like such a great medium to tell VR stories because you're not limited by anything in reality. You have control over every pixel. You can build some AI into your characters. So we feel like animation is really like the perfect medium. And I was going to add too, on the theme of getting more visibility and empathy, that something that we're quite focused on at Baobob also is being very inclusive in our characters and our cast. On Asteroids, you guys may not know, but Elizabeth Banks actually voiced Cheese, one of our main alien characters. So that was really exciting to work with such a big Hollywood name. And on our upcoming project, Rainbow Crow, we also have some pretty impressive A-list talent, such as John Legend attached, Diego Luna, and Constance Wu. And again, another interesting way to both bring visibility, but also to really heighten an awareness of the diversity in our cast and in our story. This upcoming story is very much about selflessness and sacrifice. So I think the ability to empathize with our characters has to be represented in the diversity of the characters that we're also building and animating.
Yeah, my understanding is John Legend was looking for a VR project to get involved with.
He'd been looking, and he had been approached by a number of people, but nothing felt right to him. But this story, it's based on a Native American legend, kind of one of those how an animal became the animal we know today stories. In this case, it's about a crow who has all the colors of the rainbow in his feathers and this beautiful voice of John Legend. And he's tasked to go on this journey when winter comes to try to find the Great Spirit and bring fire back to keep the animals warm. And along the way, the fire ends up singeing all of his feathers and turning them black, and the smoke from the fire gets into his throat. So that when he returns with the fire that's going to allow for the animals' survival, he's sacrificed everything that he thought gave him value. But what the story is really about is not this heroic journey, but it's about Crow coming to terms with who he's become and recognizing that these things that he might have first thought were his flaws are actually things that make him unique and different. And it's through that sort of appreciation of himself that he's able to look out into the world and appreciate the other animals, not despite of their differences, but because of their differences. And those themes that roll through the story of Rainbow Crow are the things that John felt really strongly about himself and is very active in the world in terms of trying to get more support for diversity, more acceptance of others, despite or because of their differences. And so it just sort of resonated with him. As it did with Constance Wu, who is an Asian American actor. She's in Fresh Off the Boat, and Diego Luna, who's from Mexico. And we have Randy Edmunds, who is a spokesperson for Native Americans of all tribes. He's one of the only people in the world that gets invited to be the master ceremonies at Native American celebrations that aren't of his own tribe. He's that respected. And tribes tend to be pretty insular, if I'm using that word right. And they don't like to have outsiders even from other tribes come in. But he has spent his entire life fighting for Native American rights. And he's actually the narrator for our piece. It kind of sounds like your grandfather reading you a bedtime story. So anyway, we're very excited. That's going to be a little bit of a longer piece. It's going to be probably somewhere over 20 minutes. So we're sorely sneaking up on you.
Yelena, you mentioned Dear Angelica, and it got me thinking about like one of the things that I really love about that project, aside from the fact that it's beautiful and everything, is that you can walk around inside it. And so right now we're on this, this sort of what I call like a borderline or generational change in the hardware, where the standalone is coming, more headsets, cheaper prices with the inside-out tracking, or at least 6 degrees of freedom. And so like how important is that element to, a couple of you touched on it already, but how important is that element to telling a rich story and giving the agency, and why was that particular element to be able to move around in Dear Angelica like there, as opposed to just putting you in the center of the story?
Yeah, I think there's two sides to it. The moving around and interactivity could be the best tool ever, or it could be the biggest distraction, depending on how you approach it. And some people throw in interactivity just because they want to make something that they think is innovative and doesn't really work. And I think Dear Angelica took a good approach and didn't try to do too much. You don't have touch controllers in it, so you're limited by being able to walk around. And that gives you this choice of where you are and what you're looking in, so you feel like you have agency within the experience without necessarily changing the story, because that would be distracting to it. And I think it's just a general thing. You're living in this world of these beautiful lines that Wesley Alsbrook created, and you can just tell the emotion that she put into it from every stroke that she put on, and being able just to move your body. I don't think people think enough about how our bodies and the movement of our bodies is its own emotional vehicle of telling a story. And even with interactivity and moving, like putting your hands up and putting your hands low, think about it in real life. Like if we dance in real life, it gets us excited and happy. If we have to like duck down low, it makes us feel in a certain way. If we reach out for something, that means something. So how do our body movements actually help engage in our approach to storytelling that's not just something being told to us or a choice we're given? Because our bodies are smart emotional vehicles and also just have emotional memory to them. So the more we're getting into this and the more storytelling we're putting forward where you can actually move and be expressive, I think the more powerful they're definitely going to be for people. And we're exploring a lot right now, and we're super excited about Santa Cruz. So even
tell the folks what Santa Cruz is?
The standalone headset with positional, so you can actually go around and you're not tethered to a computer, which is, I think, something everyone's really been waiting for. You know, but then on the other end, you can watch a beautiful piece by Felix and Paul, and it's just got this perfect quality to it, and you can be fully engaged in the content because the storytelling is really good. And same thing we talked about for Clouds Over Sidra. Sidra is telling you the story of her living in a Syrian refugee camp, and you feel like she's talking to you, and that's why you have that sense of intimacy. And if you give people the freedom of moving around, they might not have listened to her story. They might have been distracted and walked around somewhere else or did something. And oftentimes, if you have touch controllers, it's hard to not want to press buttons around. So how do you find that like sweet spot of making people feel part of it and expressed in it, but still giving this guidance of a director, of a storyteller, of an experience creator? And there's just that perfect balance, and some is better for positional with full interactivity, and some is just going to be better for a controlled, beautiful live action piece.
So when does that discussion happen about like which of the platforms you're developing for in a story? Is it like right from the get-go, like this is going to be for Gear VR, or is it going to be for Rift, or, you know?
Not necessarily. I mean, I think to second what Yelena's saying, we have a spectrum of possibilities, and really it's about what suits the story you want to tell. And if the story comes first, you'll find the right tools to use, hopefully, and the story will be great. And I think also it depends on what mode of viewership you want to be in. Just like there's a spectrum of the tools you have, there's a spectrum of the duration something can be. It can be episodic, 2-minute episodes, it can be 50-minute episodes, it can be one 20-minute piece, that's great. I think the same is true with mode of viewership. You know, I might be the type of person who works till 7 p.m. every night, comes home and eats dinner, and I want to sit on the couch and watch something instead of watch Netflix that night. So I might not want to do a room scale experience. But on Saturday afternoon with my 2 friends over, or my kids, I definitely want to move around. I definitely want to participate. So I think there's a lot of real estate for everyone and for a spectrum of different types of stories. And you know, for us on sort of the live action side, the one thing that we deal with that maybe the guys at Baobob don't is we're after photography and human performances. And right now, you know, if you're recording something in 3D 360 video, you sacrifice room scale. And if you're doing something in Game Engine, you might have to sacrifice, you know, photoreal faces. And if you're doing, you know, the kind of animation that these guys do, they don't have to worry about that. But if you're trying to like really have like a face that you believe is real, that's the challenge or disconnect. So you find that sometimes you have to make choices of what's more important to you. Is it, and what kind of story are you really going to tell? And sometimes you can't have it all. You have to choose your tools wisely and realize that sometimes they negate other tools.
We strongly encourage developers to think about their target platform early. And so a part of the answer to your question, Daniel, is that we don't always think about that up front, but we always should. Because what tends to happen is if you don't, because there are so many options now and there are more coming, sometimes the developer is forced into a situation where they have to, you know, port late or take an experience that is optimal on one platform and make it less optimal on another. And what we often talk to people about is if it can only be a positional tracked like experience with hand controllers, then that's okay, let's do that. But then what you sacrifice is the ubiquity of the availability of the experience and having it everywhere. But so long as you're thinking about it early and deeply about what your target is, then that's what's important.
How far ahead are you all thinking in terms of the content you're creating or the content you're supporting, and sort of like the technology has to sort of get there, that's not right there yet, but you know what I'm saying? Like,
it's hard to predict, at least for us, where anything's going to be in even 18 months. So, the fortunate thing for us is that our projects don't take 3 to 5 years like a feature film does. It takes you know, a matter of months. So we don't necessarily need to be looking even 18 months ahead, at least in terms of the content that's in production. So that's one of the advantages of kind of doing short form work. But you know, one thing I wanted to just jump back to, if you don't mind, I really liked what you said about, what Yelena said about feeling with your body, which is something that you really don't do in any other medium. And you can't overestimate what that means in VR and the importance of it. And a good example is in what Claudia was talking about earlier, where we had this game of fetch embedded inside of asteroids. And when we've had broken versions or unfinished or not, you know, early stage versions of that, and we've shown the asteroids to people, we would get comments like, why did you stop the story and do this boring ball game? And then come back, you know, you were just interrupting your story, and I couldn't understand the point of it. But once we, and it took a long time, because it's not a simple thing, but once we got the mechanics actually working right, so it really felt like natural when you threw the ball, and the ball was going where you were trying to throw it, and when the character was responding the way we wanted it to respond, to be all excited when you hold the ball in your hand. If you moved over here, just like a dog, you know, the little robot character would move over there. And once we kind of got all those things sort of working, then audience would say that was the favorite part of the whole piece. Nobody questioned why it was in. They actually loved it. And the reason was because they forgot that they were being told a story. But what they saw was that they were actually interacting. They were getting to know this little character. And it was fun, and it felt natural, and they could suspend their disbelief, and they could just go with it. Of course, the point of this for us was that later in the story, when things really do go wrong, the viewer now is in a position where they really care. You know, they care about these guys, the little guy that they play ball with and is so cute, and they care about these characters that they've kind of gotten to know. And a lot of that is through feeling like you're there. And that comes through the way you interact with the world and how you feel you can move around the world, the way that characters look at you and respond to you. And for us, it's really important to have a really tight story and control that spine. We're not doing branching storylines. It's hard enough for us to tell one story really well in a brand new medium. But what we do instead is we have branching emotions based upon the choices that the viewer makes. So if a character needs help and if the viewer helps them, then they might be rewarded by the character, by who would turn to them and say, thank you, you saved my life, or whatever. But if the viewer doesn't choose to take action on the character's behalf, the character will always find a way to get out of the problem that they're in and move the story forward. But they're not going to turn to the viewer and say, thank you, I'm glad you're a member of our team, or whatever, because the viewer didn't help them. They might even be angry at the viewer. So that's kind of an interesting way that I think that we can maintain control and tell the best story we can tell, and yet have it feel like it's playing out naturally for the viewer.
So what are some of the tech advances that are coming down the line in the short term that you think are going to be most exciting for telling stories? I'm thinking about things like eye tracking or things like that.
Eye tracking would be great, but
and AI is starting to get better. It still has a ways to go, but for instance, there is a project that Jon Favreau is working on called Gnomes and Goblins, and it uses AI, and they really focused on your relationship with the character, and the character reacts to you based on your movements. So if you're too aggressive, the little gnome is going to run away and get scared. And so you have to figure out through your actions, through your movement, how to get him to feel comfortable with you. And you find yourself being much more careful in the way you walk, but being much more sensitive to it. And it becomes really effective. And the way that he knows how to react to you because of certain movements, I felt was just really emotionally effective. think it's going to be a while until you have an AI character that feels like a natural conversational character that's not human, which is why social experiences are really great right now, because you actually have another human, but they're in the form of a different character. So the Pixar project Coco, you have the avatar of a skeleton, which is really fun. And I recently did it with my colleague Eliza, who's in the audience. And you get dressed and you go on this adventure and you're dancing and you're moving. And so that's not something you can necessarily replicate with AI just yet. So the more we figure out social experiences that are really interesting and fun, I think are gonna go a long way. But I am really excited to get to a point where experiences are intelligent and not even conversational AI, but just things that also react to you in interesting ways, like in interesting, beautiful ways that the environment can do things around you and start forming to you and personalizing to you. So it's not this interactive journey where you feel like you have to make decisions, because that, again, can be really distracting. If you have FOMO of the fear of missing out, of taking some sort of journey, but you know that you're affecting something, you know that you're part of it, and you know that you're more engaged with it. So again, finding that, and I call that more like reactive content versus interactive content.
I feel like one thing we're seeing beginning to struggle out of its infancy in a really interesting way is volumetric video. Both for environments and for characters. We recently produced a piece for the Blade Runner movie called Memory Lab, which is launching soon, where we did a bunch of holographic capture of actors. And for people to see a human being in front of them, as Ryan was saying, up until now, you've had to make that sacrifice, decide, I'm going to shoot video, which means it's going to be 3 degrees of freedom, it's going to be high quality. And to see a photographic, live-action human being in front of you and suddenly realize you can walk around them is pretty stunning the first time you see it. But then once you start mixing in things like eye tracking and look-ats and have a live-action character whose head can follow your gaze.
That's one of the keys that has to happen.
Has to happen, right.
And yeah, I think that's definitely the future. And right now there's still issues with the visual fidelity, the keyholing, the artifacts, the eyes following you and connecting with you, and then just the playback. These are really heavy files that are terabytes of data. So we've seen them in installations at film festivals, but actually getting it to the consumer or streaming it is really hard, and I'm sure it'll get solved, and everyone's working on it who's smart, but yeah.
Yeah, because with that, once you have volumetric, then you can actually use actors, and the challenge with 360 video is that you can't actually get close to an actor, so everything just feels a little bit different than you would in normal television. But if an actor is captured volumetrically, then you can have what can feel like a more real experience with them, because you can come closer, they can come around you. So that could be your version of a close-up. And mocapped actors, just when you're trying to get someone that looks somewhat real and you know that it's mocapped, you always know that something just doesn't feel quite right.
You can also blend takes, right? So you don't, like, as Felix and Paul and Ryan and the team will tell you about Mubi, everything is one big long take, so you either get that performance or you don't.
Yeah.
But with volumetric, you've got that opportunity to approach that slightly differently. But it's all, we mentioned this a little bit earlier, like all of these things are driven by, like so many of these things are tech innovations, but they really get to the next level when a developer takes it and decides to do something it wasn't designed to do, or pushes it in some way, and sometimes the experience is slightly compromised or broken or isn't everything you want it to be, but then the next version is that much better, and then it gets better and better and better. So it's all about developers.
I'd love to take some questions from the audience. Do we have a microphone out for the audience? Down here, in the front.
You mentioned volumetric video. I've also, so the 8i volumetric is inward facing, it points at an actor, but there's also the Hype VR volumetric video. You guys also doing that, the outward facing, so you're recording a whole scene with not just the actor, but everything outside the camera.
So your question is, are we doing
Are you guys doing outward facing? Because I think that's more exciting. personally, like the Hype VR type AR kit where you're zooming in and out, and I'd love to see stories like that.
You know, it's all so early. You know, we're looking at a lot of different capture solutions. There's everything from full-on light field to, to the depth kit tools that the scatter guys in New York use that are a different level of fidelity. It's all really interesting, and I think for now people are sort of mashing up different techniques. Because right now the way you capture a human and put them in an experience versus the way you capture a live action environment you're going to put that human in are totally different approaches. And the way you would do what you're describing is you'd need multiple, cameras running in an environment to gather everything you need. It's coming, but I think it's a little piece at a time.
Yeah, and it's a hard creative problem to solve because you give people some room to move, but then they can't move past that. So if you give them an ability of freedom, but then you tell them, oh, you are only free by this much, they actually realize how unfree they are. So it's hard to think of creative content ideas that really make sense and fit with that. Maybe something that's in the round, but...
Toll booth worker.
Wait, are you talking about the performer or the user? You're talking about the user.
The user.
Yeah, the user's experience of just the limited freedom that you have, because there's a project that Lytro did with called Hallelujah, which is incredibly beautiful, and you're surrounded by someone singing Hallelujah to you, but if you walk past him, everything just kind of turns to black. And it's still a really, really beautiful piece. Again, the challenge is that they can't ship that quite yet, especially in the 6DOF form. And everything we look at is what can we actually get forward to the consumer, but just also the creative use of something. Yes, you can make something technically innovative, but like Colum said, it's really just about how the artist takes that tech and turns it into something that's meaningful or that makes sense to exist.
Sir, back there.
Hi, thanks for the panel. It's been great, and I was really interested in Yelena's talking about physical agency in storytelling. She mentioned one or two examples, and I wondered if there were any other examples of kind of physical agency using your position or your sense of body presence in the stories that you would point to that you'd seen in other pieces.
Yeah, I just recently tried this project. It's called Luna. It just came out this week by a game designer, Robin Henneke, and it's just really beautiful movements where it's a narrative piece with no dialogue whatsoever, and is really just based on how you connect with the environment and what you do to progress the story. So it's really how your movements and how your decisions and the way you go around it, how your actions create a reaction in the story that propels it. But the way they approached it is just really lovely movements connected to beautiful sounds. So in one part, you're taking, what looks like a star and placing it inside of a little bucket that it's supposed to go to and continuing to move it. And the way your body moves feels very fluid. So ultimately, you feel like you're dancing somewhat. And I think that's very in line with the intention that she was trying to create, which is just this beautiful lyrical experience that takes you through this journey that she's taking you through, but really is told through your body movements.
I've got a question around, I just saw screenagers, and where is education going? Where should young people be introduced? And how far do we have to go with that and before it turns into something disastrous?
What was the first part of that question?
Education.
The first part is just where do you see VR coming into development of education? Mm-hmm. So education first, and then sort of where does it cross the line for entertainment? You see it in gaming today where children can just become immersed too far, and that's already just games. It's not VR. So sort of starting with education and then ending up with the gaming addiction type of story.
So we recommend, for the headsets we manufacture and produce for at Oculus, there's a health and safety recommendation that people are 13 and older. So that there's that, but there's no doubt that, I think one of the things that's potentially a game changer for education, especially in sort of the high school and beyond realm, are standalone headsets. Like, being able to deploy a classroom full of headsets readily with a device that isn't super tricky for the IT department to maintain and for teachers to be able to use and deploy is really powerful. And then also, I think from a content perspective, the other analog to the sense of empathy we were all talking about is I think lessons are really sticky in VR. Like when you're embodied in VR and when you have to perform an activity or you're driven to perform an activity because the narrative is so compelling, that stays with you. You don't forget it. I mean, we talked about things feeling like a memory, and actually it was Sash Gunseld who directed Dear Angelica and many other great pieces. Once said he felt VR was like a memory of a dream, and that phrase always stuck with me because it creates this perception that just doesn't leave your brain. And I think that's a very powerful idea for education. But again, it's the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, and I think all of us learn better spatially. How can we not? Versus a teacher saying words that just go into your ears. Again, that's cerebral versus learning with your entire body, and it's also learning by doing. And the great thing with, if you can learn in VR, like for instance, physics or chemistry, you can take the risks of putting together different chemicals and having it blow up in VR because you didn't do a good job rather than doing it in real life. So the way of processing information in something that fully surrounds you is just going to make it, I think, much more fun for people to learn. And then on top of that, I think the most obvious thing is history lessons of actually being taken into a space and connecting with it and connecting to a story. So it's not just these facts that come with you, it's like a connected story and an experience that you had, which I think will make it much easier for people to retain content. And at Oculus, we announced an education fund last year, so we've been actually putting a lot of thought and funding into projects that we're looking at as educational, which is exciting. And once the Oculus Go comes out and the tetherless positional headset comes out, it's going to be much more accessible for schools to be able to bring the headsets into their classrooms.
Hi, my name is Micah. My question is about responsibility when we're creating stories and working on technology for people to create these stories. And VR it's an innovative media, so that also relates to dance and animation where you have this embodied sense, and it feels like that sense of mirroring and reflection is happening to you as you watch what's happening. So as we talk about embodiment and being able to really experience what the character is going through in such a new medium, is anyone talking about best practice for the way that we portray stories, or after you watch a VR experience, is there are we talking about decompressing yet, or ways that we deal with things like being embodied in an assault, or maybe you were in an explosion? There's some real psychological impact that can happen, which is absolutely positive, but also it's how are we, as a field, starting to deal with the weight of what we are creating? And it's exciting, but it's also what's our responsibility as writers and developers?
I think it's a really good point. Every powerful medium has the power to do great good and by great ungood. And people advised women against reading books in the late 1800s because it would just be too intense for their delicate emotions, and cinema and TV and computer games have all gone through the same, degree of criticism. And it's not necessarily, I'm not suggesting that it's unhealthy to have those discussions, but I think in VR, there is something unique about experiencing things in VR where you're not remembering stories, you're generating memories. And it does feel different. And when we first took Invasion out into the world, we took a short version of it, and we didn't have time to animate the bunny. So this hawk just came in and grabbed the bunny by the head and flew away with it. So we killed the bunny because we just didn't have time to animate it. And then the aliens come down and anyway. So we were showing this, and this woman took the headset off when it was over, and she goes, that was really cool. I've never seen anything like that before. But I would never show this to my 7-year-old daughter. And I said, well, why? And she said, because you killed the bunny. And I said, well, tell me what you mean by that. And she said, well, if I was in a movie theater and you killed the bunny, you know, the adults might laugh at the dark humor, and that might lighten the load a little bit, and my daughter could look to me and say, Mommy, what happened to the bunny? And I could tell her whatever I felt like she needed to hear at that moment. But when she's got a headset on, she's out there on the ice all by herself, and I think that would just be traumatizing for her, because she can't turn to anybody. She's all alone. And I thought that was really astute. And it's something that, you know, we think about with every piece that we create, to make sure that, you know, we're not going too far in a wrong direction. And I think as creators, you know, whenever we get together in places like this, we'll talk about those sorts of things too. I don't think that there's the argument though that you know, that we shouldn't be doing VR because it has the potential to do bad, but we have to be really smart about how we approach our content.
Yeah, I was really traumatized as a kid watching Lion King, and Simba's dad died right in front of him.
Wait, what?
Sorry, I know. The new movie's coming out soon.
You haven't seen it yet.
Spoiler. Maybe a good rule of thumb would be if something could potentially be traumatic in real life, it could probably be traumatic in VR as well. But I agree that people should think about that more, or at least create space for reflection within the VR experience, because I think it could be a little bit jarring going into something where you're so emotionally connected, taking it off, and then being in a loud world. So when you're in an event-based place, you can really control the viewing, but once you take it out to consumer headsets, you have less control. So how do you build it into the environment? How do you set someone up so they understand what's about to happen, so maybe they can have a choice of whether they want to continue or not, and maybe at the end, create space for reflection depending on what the experience is. But there's also just the reality that people will be triggered and traumatized by very different things from each other depending on their personal experience. So it's hard to just think you know, in an overarching way of what's going to work for everyone at once.
I actually think, I just wanted to add to that, I think it's a really great point, because what we tend to do as practitioners is focus a lot on the technique. Like Ready at Dawn's Lone Echo, which is a VR game, produced by the Oculus Studios team, has the most amazing hands, like really incredibly detailed, articulated hands. And they glide very believably over arbitrary surfaces, and they grip really well. And you know, so a lot of the time our conversations end up being about that kind of stuff, like the verisimilitude and the fidelity of the experience rather than the actual impact of it. So I think it's an important question that we have to keep asking ourselves.
So this question piggybacks pretty well off of the previous one. I'm really inspired by stories of how VR can bring people closer together. You see like Project Be Another Person, how it increases people's empathy. I'm also like passionate about counseling and mental health. And I think a lot about like how VR could be used for exposure therapy and things like that. And so I'm curious if you could speak on it, what you think, how you think VR will be used as a tool in these ways in the future, and like how impactful you think it will be, because it is, you know, you are somewhat more separated from a person, but as it becomes more realistic, it could be more beneficial in a lot of ways.
So the question is how is VR can be used as a tool?
Therapeutic tool.
A therapeutic tool.
It's sort of two questions. It's like, do you think that it will be used as a tool in the future, and how impactful do you think it will be?
I heard this one really cool story about VR. I don't know if it answers your question, but I don't remember the hospital, but they were preparing paraplegics to wear sort of a robotic armature on their legs, and they wanted to train them to use their brain to stimulate these electrodes that would activate the motors that would allow them to walk around. And before they actually installed robotic armatures on their legs, they thought, well, an inexpensive way to start this process would be to simulate it by putting the subjects in a VR headset and then trying to generate those brain signals to activate the electrodes, but instead of the electrodes activating actual mechanical legs, it just had a simulation in the VR headset. So the person could look down and try to think what they had to think and then see if they could make their VR legs move. And that was the goal. But what they discovered is that after several months of pretty intensive therapy, that not only could they generate the appropriate signals that would activate an armature, but they were actually able to start moving their legs. And these are people with completely severed spines. So for that kind of therapy, that's pretty mind-boggling. They're also using it to treat PTSD. They're using it to treat hyperactive kids, kids with other kinds of brain disorders. I think we've just sort of scratched the surface. Entertainment is like a small wedge in this VR pie that's going to include education and tourism and real estate, and the list goes on and on. But I'm excited about what we don't know about VR and what we'll discover, because there's so much to discover. It's a big black box right now.
Hi, I have, I guess, not so much a question as a challenge. You keep talking about VR, but yet I seem to notice that a great deal of the time, possibly most of the time, what you're really excited about is interactivity and the ability for the user to interact with the characters, to interact with the story. And VR is only a tiny part of interactivity and doesn't significantly change the sort of big problems with interactive storytelling. And so I was wondering, I guess, because you haven't mentioned sort of any of the past, people have been struggling with interactive storytelling on computers for the past 40 years. Infocom, Scott Adams, Rec Art, Intfictions, the Carnegie Mellon Oz Project, Zoesis Studios, the MIT AI Lab, and there's people who run LARPs that have very similar problems with managing interactive stories in real time. And I just didn't know if you were aware of all the sort of previous history on interactive storytelling, interactive fiction, and so on, and so that you don't sort of reinvent everything.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to work in VR and be talking about the fusion of storytelling and interactivity and not to be aware of that history. My own background, I worked in film and TV for a long time. I also worked at an interactive storytelling game developer for several years, and learned how hard it is to tell an interesting, powerful, branching story. I would respectfully disagree that VR is a small part of interactivity. I think the way to think about it is effectively rendered and created VR puts you in the story in a way that feels very powerful and profound and believable. And if there's compelling interactivity on top of that, it only deepens the experience.
Hi, I'm a game developer, and I'm trying to get things that we can use in games. One of the things that stand out for me is that VR right now is very experience for yourself. So the story goes around you. It's your body that's feeling things. So have you tried any kind of like multi-user experience telling stories? Have you dealt with anything like that, experimented with it? I'm curious to know if you tried something like that.
Yeah, social storytelling. Yeah, so I think I mentioned the Pixar project that's coming out next month, Coco, is a social experience. So you can be in the space with friends as avatars going through this fun journey together, and it greatly enhances the experience. And Facebook is making huge strides also in social VR. There's a team called Spaces, and that's all about how people connect with each other and just fully focused on social and platforming and elevating that and understanding how to best make a place for people to come together. And then I mentioned a project I really liked called Life of Us, which was two people going on a journey together, which was incredibly fun, and we're starting to see a lot more of that. It's going to get much better once we also just have a lot more people in VR, because you need people in VR at the same time to have a social experience together. So we're not recommending that everyone make social-only types of experiences just currently, but we're definitely investigating that a lot.
One thing that I think is interesting about social right now is just some of the announcements from OC4. Social in headset is great, but there's also now social outside of a headset where you can watch someone else playing a game or do an experience. And not only does that serve to tie people in who don't have headsets, but also I think it's a great marketing tool for VR to be able to broadcast what you're doing, what you're experiencing. Even if you can't fully experience it the way it's intended, it's driving awareness.
I wanted to actually talk about social also, but the sort of, given we're almost out of time, the one sort of question I have about that is like, what's like the one or two things that are most important for creating a sense of presence if you're going to have multiple people in a VR environment together?
Latency is
latency. That feels like the floor, right? Like it has to be smooth, a smooth experience that doesn't feel remotely laggy or juddery or anything like that.
I think we're out of time. Are we? Is that right? Yeah. One more question, maybe right here.
Just a quick question. So I was wondering, do you notice that there's a certain content that may not be suitable for the immersiveness of VR, or actually works, the immersiveness works or backfires? So there was the case where people create a mod for Grand Theft Auto, if you're familiar with that IP or games, right? And after people play that, at first they thought it's a great idea, right? You know, you play VR in Grand Theft Auto, but then after a few minutes playing it, or several sessions, people say, you know what, this makes me feel like a bad person. Which, instead of, like, if you play on a screen, it feels like a parody, you know, like, because it's a detached experience. But when it's a VR, it becomes real, and even if it's just graphic, it's no longer being fun. And so again, my question is, do you think there's a certain contents that may not work on VR, or we shouldn't even try to bring that to VR?
I think
goes back to Micah's point, right?
Well, I was just going to say about Grand Theft Auto. I remember I used to play the first version where it was from above, you know, like a sky view, and I'm ashamed to admit it, but we all did it. I would just mow people down in my car, you know. That's part of the game, right? But then when it became PlayStation and I was actually at scale, the graphic nature of it became, I think, more intense, and you were at least aware of it, right? And now if you're actually, like you said, in that story, it does feel more real. Maybe it's not photoreal, but I think you start to feel a little closer to that. So I guess I have a wonder in myself of just, there's all kinds of these like graphic R-rated games out right now for PC or for consoles. I wonder if that will continue in VR, or if it will feel too real even for people who really enjoy that stuff. I'm curious. I don't know.
Yeah. I also just wanted to add to your social question, because I do think it's an important one. I think the other thing that's really important is the representation of yourself in your VR when you're with someone else. So making sure that your personality can shine, and what interactions can you have to show your personality through gestures, through the way you actually look. Do you feel connected? And it doesn't have to look like you necessarily. It can work when you're an avatar as a skeleton as you can in Coco, or within spaces where it's actually something like you. But how do you make someone know that it's you? And it can come through voice, but mostly just allowing for just gestural input that feels expressive.
Great. I think we are out of time. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thanks for coming.